In February of 1355, a fight over bad wine in one small tavern turned into one of the bloodiest riots in the history of Oxford. By the time it was over, dozens of scholars lay dead in the streets, and the town was forced into a punishment that lasted for almost 500 years. Most people who visit Oxford today walk right past the exact spot where this happened, with no idea that a fight over a bad drink once reshaped the entire balance of power in that city. This is the story of the St. Scholastica Day Riot, the single event that best explains why Oxford students and townspeople hated each other for centuries. In this video, you'll learn exactly how a simple argument over drink exploded into mass violence, how many people actually died, why the university ended up more powerful afterward instead of weaker, and why the town had to apologize every single year until 1825. Let's start at the beginning, in a tavern called the Swindlestock, right near the center of Oxford at a crossing point known as Carfax. The date was the 10th of February, 1355, the feast day of St. Scholastica. Two Oxford scholars were drinking there and complained about the quality of the wine, or in some versions, the ale. Whatever was said, it escalated fast, and the scholars ended up throwing their drinks directly at the tavern keeper's face in front of a room full of witnesses. That single act of throwing a drink is the spark that historians point to as the start of everything that followed. But here's the important part. That tavern argument didn't create the hatred between scholars and townspeople. It just gave that hatred an excuse to explode into the open. To understand why things spiraled so quickly, you need to understand what medieval Oxford actually was. The university back then wasn't just a school. It was a legally privileged community sitting right in the middle of an ordinary working town. Scholars often had special legal protections, were tried in separate courts, and claimed exemptions that ordinary townspeople never had. Meanwhile, the regular people of Oxford had to deal with all the disruption that came with hosting large numbers of young male students, rowdy behavior, unpaid debts, disputes over rent, and constant friction over local laws that didn't seem to apply equally to everyone. This wasn't the first time it had boiled over either. Oxford had already seen serious town and gown conflict before, including a major rupture back in 1209 that was so bad, it actually pushed some scholars completely out of Oxford, contributing to the founding of Cambridge. By 1355, more than a century of built-up resentment was sitting just under the surface, waiting for a spark. So when word of the tavern fight spread, it didn't stay contained to a few angry men. Church bells started ringing across the town, and in medieval Oxford, ringing bells was essentially an emergency alert system, a way to summon large groups of people fast. Once those bells rang, supporters poured in from all directions, students on one side, townspeople and their allies on the other, each group arriving with whatever weapons or improvised tools they had close at hand. What began as one drunken argument turned, within hours, into a running battle through the streets of Oxford. Now let's talk about how bad it actually got, because the numbers here are what make this story so shocking. The most commonly repeated figure is 63 scholars killed, with townspeople losses usually put at around 30, though medieval record-keeping wasn't perfectly precise, so exact numbers do vary a little between different historical sources. What's not disputed is the basic outcome. The scholars came off far worse in the actual fighting, a fact that becomes even more striking once you remember they were the ones who arguably started the whole confrontation with that first thrown drink at the tavern keeper. Some accounts describe the violence lasting 2 full days. Others describe it stretching closer to 3, depending on exactly how the timeline gets counted. Either way, this wasn't a small scuffle between a few hot-headed students and angry locals. This was a full-blown urban battle, with weapons involved, streets turned into contested ground, and a death toll high enough to genuinely shock people across the region when news of it spread. For a university that saw itself as a center of learning and religious life, this was nothing short of a disaster. It also tells you something about how medieval communities actually mobilized in a crisis. There was no police force to call, no modern emergency system. Bells rang, word spread by mouth, and armed supporters converged on the same streets within a matter of hours. That's part of why this single event works so well as a story on its own, instead of just one line inside a long timeline of Oxford's history. It shows Oxford not as some peaceful place full of quiet libraries and old stone buildings, but as a dangerous, high-stakes power struggle between two groups who deeply distrusted each other. Before we move to what happened next, it's worth pausing on just how mismatched this fight really was. On one side, you had university scholars, many of them young men living away from home for the first time, often without weapons of their own, and without deep local support networks in the town itself. On the other side, you had the town's own residents, backed by neighbors, tradesmen, and armed supporters, who had lived in Oxford their whole lives and knew every street and alley of the place. Once the bells rang and reinforcements started arriving, the numbers tilted heavily in the town's favor, which helps explain why the scholars ended up suffering the worst of the casualties once the fighting spread beyond that first tavern. It's also worth remembering that medieval Oxford had no organized police force to step in and separate the two sides. Once armed groups started converging from different directions, there was genuinely nothing stopping the violence from escalating block by block until outside authority finally arrived to shut it down. Now let's get into the aftermath, because this is where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn. You might expect that after losing so many of their own people in the fighting, the university would come out of this weaker, maybe even humiliated in front of royal authorities. The opposite happened. Royal and church officials investigated the riot, and the final settlement ended up strongly favoring the university, not the town. The town's civic leaders were publicly punished and humiliated, and the university's existing privileges were reinforced and expanded even further than before. Reports described the post-riot charter strengthening the university's authority over legal and commercial matters affecting both scholars and everyday town life, giving Oxford's academic community even more control over pricing, weights, measures, and local trade disputes than it already held before the riot broke out. Think about how strange that outcome really is. The university took the heavier losses in the actual violence, yet it walked away from the whole affair with more institutional power than it had going in. Victimhood, in this case, turned directly into political leverage. And the punishment placed on the town wasn't just a one-time fine that faded from memory. The mayor and the town's bailiffs were ordered to perform a public penance every single year on St. Scholastica Day, walking to St. Mary's Church and paying a fine of 1 penny for every scholar who had been killed in the riot. Picture that for a second. The town's own leaders, year after year, publicly walking through the streets in a ritual of submission to the very institution their townspeople had fought against in the streets. This wasn't a punishment that lasted a few years and quietly faded away. This ceremony continued for nearly 5 centuries, all the way until 1825, when the sitting mayor finally refused to keep participating, and the tradition was allowed to lapse for good. Just sit with that timeline for a moment. A single riot in 1355 created a ritual of civic humiliation that outlived kingdoms, wars, and entire eras of English history, only ending in the early 1800s. Think about everything that happened in England during those centuries while this ceremony kept quietly repeating every February. The Wars of the Roses, the Tudor dynasty, the English Civil War, the rise of the British Empire, and the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Through all of it, Oxford's mayor kept walking that same short route to St. Mary's Church, paying that same symbolic penny per scholar, generation after generation, as a permanent reminder of who held power in that town. It's a genuinely rare example of a single afternoon of violence directly producing a civic tradition that outlasted almost every other institution around it. That's one of the most remarkable long-term consequences you'll find connected to any medieval event, and it's a huge part of why this single flashpoint deserves its own story instead of being buried inside a broader Oxford history overview. Now, it's worth being careful here and not turning this into a simple story of noble scholars versus an ignorant, violent mob. Medieval scholars were far from perfect angels wandering peacefully through the streets. Records from the period complain regularly about student behavior, including robbery, assault, and general lawlessness connected to the young men living in the university community. These weren't isolated complaints from a few bitter townspeople either. Disputes over unpaid rent, unpaid tavern bills, and rowdy public behavior show up repeatedly in the surviving records of medieval Oxford, painting a picture of a student population that could be just as disruptive to daily town life as any resentful local mob accused of starting trouble. Townspeople weren't just innocent background characters either. They were defending real economic and legal interests, and they had genuine grievances about how the university's privileges affected their daily lives. The riot wasn't a clash between one good side and one bad side. It was a clash between two groups who each had legitimate complaints, but who also both carried real capacity for violence when tensions finally broke. The legal system afterward simply chose one side to protect, and it wasn't the town. This is also a useful reminder that medieval universities weren't just quiet centers of prayer and study tucked away from the real world. They functioned much more like political corporations, bargaining for legal privileges, defending their own interests in court, disciplining their own members, and guarding jealously over every advantage they had already secured from the crown or the church. Scholars in this period weren't passive bookworms hiding behind library walls. They were young men embedded in a system that gave them real legal leverage over the town hosting them, and they were fully willing to use that leverage, sometimes aggressively, in disputes over rent, debt, and daily behavior. Townspeople, in turn, weren't simply background extras standing around waiting to be victimized. They were defending their own homes, their own businesses, and their own legal standing in a city where an entire privileged class of outsiders could often act with limited accountability to local authority. Seen this way, the St. Scholastica Day Riot opens up into much bigger questions than just one bad night at one tavern. Questions about urban governance, about who gets legal immunity and who doesn't, about the economics of running a university town, and about what happens when a semi-independent elite community gets planted directly inside an ordinary working city. There's also something worth noticing about exactly where this all started. A tavern, not a lecture hall, not a church, not a formal meeting between university and town officials. In medieval urban life, taverns were places where people from different social classes actually mixed together, and where insults over something as small as bad wine could trigger conflicts about deeper issues like status, honor, and masculinity. A cheap or poorly made drink might sound like a trivial complaint today, but in a tightly wound social hierarchy like medieval Oxford, it was exactly the kind of small spark that could set off something far bigger, because the real tension was already sitting there, just waiting for an excuse. Taverns in this period weren't neutral gathering spaces the way a modern bar might feel today. They were places where debt, reputation, and public standing were constantly on display, where a perceived insult could be witnessed by a room full of people and repeated across the town within hours. Throwing a drink at the tavern keeper wasn't just a rude gesture aimed at one man behind a counter. It was a public act, witnessed by other patrons, that instantly turned a private complaint about quality into a visible challenge that demanded some kind of response, one way or another, right there in front of everyone. That's part of why the fight didn't stay contained to two angry scholars and one frustrated tavern keeper for very long. This event is also the reason the phrase, town and gown, became such a lasting way to describe university versus city tension, a phrase that's still used today whenever a college campus and its surrounding community clash over noise, rent, policing, or local influence. Oxford, in 1355, had two overlapping communities operating under completely different sets of rules. The gown side represented legal privilege, clerical protection, and academic prestige. The town side represented ordinary working life and a deep, often justified resentment about a powerful institution that didn't have to answer to the same laws everyone else did. When that arrangement worked, it produced centuries of prosperity and cultural prestige for the city. When it broke down, as it did in February 1355, the result was public bloodshed in the streets and a ceremony of forced humiliation that lasted nearly 500 years. It's worth noticing how modern this tension still feels, even nearly 7 centuries later. Plenty of college towns today still argue about rising rents driven by student demand, about noise complaints, about how much local policing should bend toward protecting a university's reputation over its neighbors' daily peace, and about whether a large institution enriches the town around it or quietly dominates it instead. The scale of these modern disputes is nowhere near as violent as 1355, obviously, but the underlying structural tension between an institution's privilege and a community's daily reality is strikingly recognizable, even now. It's also worth flagging that popular retellings of this event sometimes get a little too neat and confident with specific details. Exact casualty numbers, the precise words exchanged in the tavern, and certain named individuals often get repeated with more certainty than the medieval sources can actually support, since records from this period were compressed, and sometimes dramatized by the people writing them down afterward. Medieval chroniclers weren't neutral journalists taking careful notes in the moment. They were often writing years later, shaping the story to fit a particular narrative, whether that meant emphasizing the university's suffering to justify harsher punishment for the town, or smoothing over inconvenient details that complicated a simpler good versus bad version of events. That doesn't mean the core story is unreliable. It means the broad shape of what happened is solid, even while some of the smaller decorative details deserve a bit of healthy skepticism rather than blind repetition. The safest, most solid version of the story is this. A complaint about bad drink at the Swindlestock Tavern escalated rapidly into mass violence across Oxford. The scholars suffered heavier losses in the fighting itself, and a resulting settlement subordinated the town ceremonially to the university for centuries afterward, right up until a defiant mayor finally ended the ritual in 1825. Those core facts are well established, even if some of the smaller dramatic details have been polished over time in the retelling. When you step back and look at the full shape of this story, it has almost every ingredient you'd want in a single dramatic event. A trivial spark, decades of hidden tension underneath it, a massive violent overreaction, public bloodshed in the streets, an official punishment handed down from royal and church authorities, and a consequence so long-lasting it stretched from the age of knights all the way to the age of steam engines. You don't need centuries of Oxford's full history to understand what this university was really like in the medieval world. You just need these 2 or 3 days in February of 1355, when privilege, class resentment, violence, ceremony, law, and long memory all collided at once in the middle of one small English town. And that collision is exactly why, almost 500 years after it ended, people are still talking about a fight that started over a bad cup of wine. If a single riot could reshape a city's power structure for 5 centuries, imagine what other small historical incidents are secretly responsible for institutions and traditions you still recognize today. That's exactly what we're covering in the next video, where we break down another overlooked historical flashpoint hiding behind a tradition you probably assumed was always just normal, one that started just as small and just as accidentally as a bad cup of wine in a crowded medieval tavern. Watch that video next, because history's smallest sparks are almost always the ones nobody expects.